Mac Miller.
Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a hot review, because it's hot in here, of the new Mac Miller album, Watching Movies with the Sound Off. Mac Miller, aka Easy Mac with the Cheesy Raps, is a Pittsburgh rapper. This is his latest full-length album, I believe his second commercial release. And Mac Miller has become one of hip-hop's most polarizing figures over the past few years. Now, Mac caught a lot of hype off of his earlier mixtapes, singles, and videos, a lot of which I liked, not because they were deep and conscious and pushing the envelope or anything like that, but because they were just lighthearted and sometimes a little introspective. And Mac continued to gain popularity, but he was dropping more and more projects that I didn't really care for and putting himself in these lanes in hip-hop that I felt were maybe, I don't know, a little uninspired, either being just a very boring weed rapper or a bubblegum pop rapper. His flows were becoming more underwhelming, and it was getting harder and harder to take him seriously when he would go into this more deep and introspective side of his personality. This was at its worst on albums like Blue Slide Park and the incredibly nauseating jazz EP that he put out under a completely different name. And I am happy to say that Watching Movies with the Sound Off, while it's not going to be one of my favorite hip-hop albums of this year, it is improvements on pretty much all fronts for Mac Miller, with flow, with lyrics, production, and features. With the feature list on this thing with Schoolboy Q, Action Bronson, Ab-Soul, a really awesome verse from Loaded Lux, sort of talking about the change in Mac Miller's personality over the course of his career, and of course Earl Sweatshirt.
And don't forget MCJP Electronics.
With the features on here, he's really keeping his ear to the underground and just really keeping it kind of gritty and picking those artists who have their own dark styles. And Mac Miller pretty much does that with the production on this thing too. Blue Slide Park was definitely an album where you could hear him getting a little bit more groomed and cleaner, but Watching Movies with the Sound Off is a step in the more underground direction, bringing more beats from Clams Casino on here, one of which is on the track Birdcall and is not in his usual cloud rap style. It's actually a banger, and Chuck English is on this LP as well, bringing some beats. Flying Lotus is on here, The Alchemist, Earl as well, Pharrell, and there are a handful of songs on here that Mac Miller actually produces himself under the name Larry Fisherman. Tracks like Star Room, which is a beat from Earl Sweatshirt, actually one of the best instrumentals on this album. I did not know Earl had this kind of talent in him to produce a beat this interesting. The murky bass, the reversed warped guitars on here too. It's all psychedelic, trippy, feeling kind of smoky, blunted. It's very colorful, and the instrumentals continue to be colorful on this thing with tracks like Avian, which has these really interesting plinky piano samples playing over and over and over, and when the hook comes through, these champagne room strings start soaring over the instrumental. Of course, the beat hits hard on this track, as well as the song Somebody Do Something, which a lot of people freaked out about initially when it got put out as a single because Flylo handled the production on this. Hearing Mac Miller and Flying Lotus on the same track, kind of a surprise, but I gotta say my only real disappointment with this song is that it's not one of Flying Lotus's better beats. It's really just Flying Lotus by the numbers. If anything, I think the name Flying Lotus carries way more weight on this instrumental than the instrumental itself. Tracks like Watching Movies has a really strong trap flavor to it. There's a handful of songs toward the back end of this LP that go more for that cloud rap vibe, and the song Matches is maybe the most bubblegum poppy song on here, with this really sweet psychedelic synth lead that was sampled straight from a Black Moth Super Rainbow track. What I really admire about Watching Movies with the Sound Off the most is how consistent Mac is in picking beats, whether they're trap, cloud rap, whatever. It's all really just textured, colorful, kind of psychedelic, and even Mac Miller's beats hold their own against some of the other instrumentals on this LP. As far as instrumentals go, I really can't complain about not a single song on here. Now, as far as flows go, on some of his more recent projects, Mac has really been putting me to sleep with how understated and basic some of his verses can be. And unfortunately, that is still the issue for me on this album at times, but Mac does make some serious efforts and some serious improvements. The song I Am Who I Am, which has a really slow, spacey beat, a really fantastic R&B style vocal hook, Mac Miller is all over this song, spitting some of the fastest flows I've heard him do in a while. And changing up his flows too, chopping it up into fourths, into eighths, sixteenths, and triplets, speeding up and slowing down in a lot of interesting ways. And the song Birdcall is another track on here where Mac does that kind of monotone, understated thing, but because the beat is so just over the top, and because Mac Miller, some of his lyrics are so funny, it does work for him. If there was anything that really kind of left me hanging in terms of flows, it's songs like Aquarium, where the tempo really slows down and it forces Mac to slow down as well. And as he is rapping so much slower on this track, he slips a little bit in and out of tempo, and it's like going this pace forces him to concentrate more on what he's doing, and he doesn't really come off as charismatic or as passionate. And of course, there are a number of songs on here where Mac Miller is singing, not just on the hook, but for a majority of the track. Songs like Objects in Mirror or Euphoria, the last track on this LP. And while Mac Miller doesn't really throw out a lot of sour notes, and he does save my ears from some really badly applied auto-tune, all I can really say is that Mac Miller is just a passable singer on these songs. Now the lyrics on this album, I do think they're the weakest link in the chain, but it's another improvement for Mac Miller if you're going to compare it to his last few mixtapes and Blue Slide Park. And I do realize that Mac Miller, he can be a little bit much at times because of all the sort of goofy and cartoony imagery and freeform verses that he seems to throw out there. Lines that reference blind people trying to find the bathroom, moments where Mac Miller isn't showering, clever lines where he asks whether or not Jesus made $1 million off of selling the cross, or if you get a clue, what does the clue get? Punching fans if they get the words wrong, or even being in kindergarten putting condoms in your cubby. Across this album, Mac Miller is pretty silly, but not as obnoxious as he has been in the past, for sure. The one downside is that Mac Miller's thoughts, they don't really cover a wide array of topics, really. You got girls, you got success, you got drugs, and there are a lot of hip-hop songs out there on those topics, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just that when Mac Miller raps about them, they're rarely assembled into a cohesive theme, story, or song idea. But there are spots on here that are pretty thematic, like Matches, where him and Ab-Soul really seem to be kind of getting a little nostalgic about their past. Star Room, where Mac Miller really sort of catches the plight of his current spot in his music career. And then there is Remember, which is actually a somewhat touching tribute to a friend of his, a personal friend who had passed away. Even though Mac Miller is pretty messy when it comes to his song ideas and song themes and just lyrics and verses at times, still, if you take all these little puzzle pieces and you assemble them and you put them together, you do get a pretty vivid image of who Mac Miller is. Now, this picture isn't engaging throughout this entire LP. You're handed a lot of the same puzzle pieces over and over and over again. I think you really gotta love Mac Miller as a person to really get into this album, considering how personal it can be at times. I like this album, but I didn't love it. I mean, there are tracks on here that I really enjoyed, but some of his raps do get old for me, get a little stale, and hearing him sing, while it's not terrible, it just really does nothing for me. Plus, you have a handful of tracks on here where Mac Miller is sort of pitch shifting his voice for what reason, I don't really know why. There are a few spots where he does it to bring it to a lower pitch and sort of create this adult-like figure in the way that Tyler, the Creator, would. I'm feeling a strong 6 to a light 7 on this thing. If you've given it a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. This review is my opinion. If you don't like it, here's a straw. I want to give a shout out to Low, the SHEBREW Slammer, Dan, Mutant Radio, and Baz. I love you. Only the strong subscribe. All mistakes were intentional. Anthony Fantano, Mac Miller, forever.